I almost didn't send this in because even now, I can't prove any of it happened the way I think it did. There are no arrests, nobody was caught, the police never called me back with answers. All I have are a few reports, a security video that still makes me uncomfortable to watch, and a lot of little memories that didn't seem important until it was too late. This happened about 2 years ago. At the time, I was living alone in a second floor apartment outside Columbus. It wasn't a bad place. Rent was affordable, my neighbors mostly kept to themselves, and I'd been there long enough that everything felt familiar. I worked from home for a software company, so my routine rarely changed. I'd wake up around 7, make coffee, answer emails, work until 5, cook dinner, watch YouTube for an hour or two, then go to bed. Every day looked almost exactly like the one before it. Looking back, I think that's why it took me so long to notice something was wrong. When your life is built on routine, you stop paying attention to the little things. The first thing I noticed was my apartment key. I keep my keys in the same ceramic bowl next to the front door every single day. I've done that since I moved in, because if I don't, I'll spend 20 minutes tearing the apartment apart looking for them. One Tuesday morning, they weren't there. I checked my pockets, my backpack, the kitchen counter. Nothing. I even looked in the refrigerator because I've absent-mindedly set things down in strange places before. After about 15 minutes, I gave up and called work to tell them I'd be a little late. Then I walked back toward the front door. The keys were sitting in the bowl. Exactly where they should have been. I actually laughed. I remember saying out loud, "You're losing it." That was the explanation I chose. Not because it made the most sense, because it was the least frightening. A few days later, my TV remote disappeared. I found it sitting perfectly in the center of the coffee table. Then my wallet ended up on the bathroom sink. Then one of my kitchen chairs was pushed in when I knew I'd left it pulled out after dinner. Each time I found a reason. Maybe I was distracted. Maybe I was tired. Maybe working from home was making me absent-minded. Looking back now, I think that's what scares me the most. Not that someone may have been inside my apartment. It's how quickly I convinced myself that I couldn't trust my own memory. About a week later, I was carrying groceries upstairs when my downstairs neighbor, Denise, waved me over. Denise had lived in the building for years. She always seemed to know everyone's business, but not in an annoying way. She'd water the flowers near the entrance every morning and usually stop to chat with whoever walked by. She smiled and asked, "Did your sister ever make it back home?" I laughed because I assumed she'd mistaken me for someone else. "My sister?" "The woman who's been visiting you." I remember smiling for another second before it slowly faded. "I don't have a sister." Denise looked confused. "Oh, I just figured she was family." I asked her what she meant. She pointed toward my apartment. "I've seen a woman in your window a couple of times this past week. She never stays long." I didn't answer right away. Not because I believed her, because she sounded completely certain. I eventually told her she must have been looking at the wrong apartment. She apologized. We both laughed. I carried my groceries upstairs. But before I unlocked my door, I looked through my own living room window. There wasn't enough room for someone to stand where Denise said she'd seen them. Not unless they were already inside. I unlocked the door. The apartment was silent. Everything looked exactly the way I'd left it. I remember feeling embarrassed. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have called the police that day. I didn't tell anyone about what Denise had said. Not my parents, not my friends. I think I was worried that saying it out loud would make it seem more real. Instead, I started paying closer attention. Not in an obsessive way, just little things. I'd take a second look before leaving the apartment. I'd glance into every room before going to bed. I'd make sure the deadbolt was locked twice instead of once. After a few days, I started feeling ridiculous. Nothing else happened. No missing items, no strange noises, no woman in the window. I remember thinking that Denise probably had seen someone in another apartment and simply mixed them up. It made sense, almost identical from the parking lot. Life settled back into normal, until the spare key. I kept a second apartment key inside a small fireproof safe in my bedroom closet. It wasn't hidden particularly well, but nobody besides me knew it existed. At least that's what I thought. One Tuesday evening, I came home after picking up dinner. I set the food on the kitchen counter, took my shoes off, walked into the bedroom to change clothes, but when I came back out, the spare key was lying on the counter. At first, I didn't even react. I just stared at it. It took a few seconds before my brain caught up. I walked back into the bedroom. I opened the closet. I unlocked the safe. The envelope where I kept the spare key was empty. I checked every shelf inside. Nothing. The key sitting on my kitchen counter was the one that had been inside the safe. I picked it up. The little blue rubber keychain was faded in exactly the same spot where I'd accidentally melted it against a candle months earlier. I stood in the middle of my apartment for probably 10 minutes trying to remember taking it out. I couldn't. I called my mom. Not because I thought someone had broke it in, because I honestly thought I might be forgetting things. I asked her if she ever noticed me becoming absent-minded. She laughed. "You've always been forgetful." That wasn't comforting. The next morning, I bought a small notebook. Every time I left the apartment, I wrote down a few things. Front door locked, bedroom window closed, spare key in safe, remote on couch. Nothing unusual. It felt silly, but it also made me feel like I was taking control of the situation. For almost a week, everything matched. Nothing moved, nothing disappeared. I started thinking I'd solved the problem. Maybe writing things down forced me to pay attention. Maybe I really had been forgetting. Then Friday happened. Work let everyone leave early because of an outage. I got home just after 1 in the afternoon, almost 4 hours earlier than usual. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed a dark gray sedan parked near the mailboxes. The engine was running. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat. I couldn't make out their face because the windshield reflected the sky. As soon as I parked, the sedan pulled away. It wasn't dramatic, no screeching tires, no sudden acceleration. It simply left. I didn't think much of it until I reached my apartment door. It wasn't wide open. It wasn't broken. It was just not completely closed. Maybe an inch. Enough that a strip of darkness was visible between the door and the frame. I stopped walking. I was absolutely certain I'd locked it that morning. I stood there for a few seconds hoping I'd hear a television. Music, footsteps, anything. The apartment was completely silent. Instead of going inside, I backed away and called 911. The dispatcher asked if I could see anyone. I told her no. She asked if I knew whether anyone else had a key. The landlord, I said. And I guess whoever made copies when the locks were installed. A few minutes later, 2 officers arrived. They searched every room. Closets, bathroom, even under the bed. Nobody was there. Nothing had been stolen, no signs of forced entry. One of the officers looked at the lock for a while before turning back to me. "It doesn't look like anyone kicked this in." "I know. Sometimes apartment doors don't catch all the way." I nodded. It sounded reasonable. Then he asked if I wanted to make a report anyway. I almost said no. Then I remembered the woman Denise had seen in my apartment. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. "I don't think you're making this up." He paused. "But right now, we don't have anything we can investigate." He handed me a business card before leaving. "If anything changes, call us immediately." I slipped the card into my wallet. At the time, I hoped I'd never need it. I ended up carrying that card with me for almost 6 months. The following morning, I bought 2 indoor security cameras. One faced the front door, the other pointed toward my living room. I didn't tell anyone I'd installed them. I figured if something happened, I'd return them and laugh about the whole thing later. For the first 4 nights, they recorded exactly what you'd expect. Me leaving for work, me coming home, nothing else. By the 5th night, I started feeling embarrassed. I was already planning to take the cameras down that weekend. Then my phone buzzed during lunch. Motion detected. The notification had come in at 11:43 that morning. I was at work. I opened the clip expecting to see sunlight through the window or maybe a shadow from a passing car. Instead, I watched my front door slowly open. No one kicked it in, no one forced it. It opened the way it would if someone already had a key. A man stepped inside wearing a gray hoodie and a baseball cap. His face never looked toward the camera. He closed the door behind him. Then he just stood there for almost 2 minutes, not moving, not searching, just standing in the middle of my apartment like he was listening. Eventually, he walked into the living room. He picked up the TV remote, set it back down in a different spot, straightened one of the couch cushions, walked into the kitchen, closed the refrigerator, closed it again. He never stole anything. He never damaged anything. It almost looked like he was checking that everything was where he expected it to be. Before leaving, he walked down the hallway toward my bedroom. He disappeared from the living room camera for about 30 seconds. Then he came back carrying nothing. He locked the front door behind him as he left. I called the detective before I even called my parents. They collected the footage that afternoon. The detective told me it was one of the strangest burglary reports he's ever worked. Usually people take something, he said. This guy acted like he lived there. The locks were changed that same evening. The apartment complex also reprogrammed the electronic entry records for maintenance staff. No one could explain how he got inside. The detective believes someone had copied a key at some point before I moved in. They checked maintenance employees, former tenants, even contractors. Nothing ever led anywhere. I moved out less than 2 weeks later. I didn't care that it cost me money to break the lease. I never wanted to sleep in that apartment again. About 8 months later, Denise called me. She'd kept my number in case any mail showed up after I'd moved. We talked for a minute before she hesitated. Then she asked, "Do you remember that woman I told you I saw in your apartment?" I told her I did. She was quiet for a few seconds. I think I was wrong. I asked her what she meant. She said she'd seen the new tenant outside earlier that week. They'd been chatting when the woman mentioned she lived alone. Denise laughed and said, "Well, not if your sister's still visiting." The woman looked confused. She told Denise she didn't have a sister either. That was the moment Denise called me. The detective never solved my case. No one was ever arrested. Maybe the locks being changed finally stopped whoever it was. Maybe they simply found someone else. I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. For months after I moved, I couldn't shake that feeling that I'd forgotten something. Then, while cleaning out an old box from that apartment, I found the notebook I'd used to keep track of where I left things. Most of the entries were exactly as I remembered. Keys in bowl, remote on couch, spare key in safe. But one page near the end caught my attention. There was a sentence I had absolutely no memory of writing. It was in my handwriting. The ink matched the rest of the notebook. It simply said, "If anything is different when I get home tomorrow, I'm calling the police." The date at the top of the page was 2 days before I ever made that first 911 call. I still don't remember writing it. Maybe I did. Maybe I was more frightened than I allowed myself to admit. Or maybe I knew something was wrong, long before I was willing to believe it.